Support for the Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you in part by University of Idaho, Idaho's only Carnegie R1 classified research university. Our Carnegie R1 designation recognizes the discoveries we make that help our forests thrive. It means we're creating more doctors and doing real research to strengthen cybersecurity for Idaho businesses, our energy sector, and every Idahoan. More at go.uidaho.edu/Idaho-is-Idaho.
Start the new year with a commitment to independent journalism. When you become a supporter of Boise State Public Radio, you ensure deeper reporting, stronger investigations, and the trusted coverage you rely on every day.
I'm very grateful for all of the balanced reporting, and I will continue to be a sustaining member.
Your gift keeps fact-based news available to everyone in our region. Begin the new year by becoming a donor at boisestatepublicradio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. Across the West, ranchers use public lands to graze their cattle and sheep. That rangeland adds up to a space twice the size of California. A complicated system of permits and subsidies are supposed to keep animals from harming the land or waterways. But a recent investigation from ProPublica found that the system is overtaxed and the Bureau of Land Management can't keep up with their job of investigating and repairing environmental damage done to the landscape. Mark Olalde covers the environment, natural resources, and public health around the Southwest for ProPublica, and he is the author of the series Free Range, The High Cost of Public Lands Ranching. And he's joining us now to talk more about this. Mark, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Mark, you did a deep dive into grazing on public lands, and it focused on how the BLM is just not able to keep up with environmental reviews. So what got you started investigating this particular topic?
So public lands ranching is far and away the largest land use in the West. As you said in the intro, more than twice the size of California. And so really we just wanted us to ask and answer some questions. If this is what we've decided that we're going to use the sweeping landscapes of the West for, are we doing it the right way?
And you looked at grazing subsidies and the politics of grazing, but what I do want to dive into right now is the environmental effects of grazing and how the BLM is actually struggling to keep up with the permitting of that. And my understanding is that you found that 75% of BLM's land is being grazed without an environmental review. So how much land are we talking about, and where is that land?
So that land is really spread all over the West. Every Western state, you'll find these parcels of grazed land called allotments that have been reauthorized for a 10-year grazing permit without environmental review. And the reason we're seeing that is because in 2014, largely at the behest of the livestock industry, Congress put in a must-pass defense authorization bill that that permits would be automatically renewed even without an environmental review, which had until that point been mandated by law, if the agencies in charge, BLM and Forest Service, didn't have the capacity, couldn't do the reviews. And we've seen the use of this kind of exemption, conservationists call it the loophole. We've seen the use of that explode over the past 10 to 15 years.
Okay, so then between 20 and 24, the BLM lost almost 40% of its rangeland management staff. That's a big number. And then another 10% have left since just November. So how is this impacting environmental reviews of grazing land? Because you're talking upwards of 50% of their staff.
Yeah, so to put it in perspective, a single rangeland management employee with the Bureau of Land Management has an area about the size of Denver that they have to know. And when I say know, I mean they need to get on the land. They need to know which pastures are doing well, which waterways have cattle in them, have sheep grazing on the banks. They need to know it at the plant level. And so to think of an area, of a metropolis per person, they just frankly can't get to all of it. And so when you don't get to all of it, there's unpermitted grazing that goes unchecked in certain areas. There's these environmental reviews that you just can't get to in other areas. And we're seeing this all across the West, and it's only being amplified as President Trump and Elon Musk have kind of downsized the staff of the federal government.
So you talked to current and former BLM employees. What did you find out about how permits are authorized?
So there's kind of a culture of not wanting to poke the bear within the
Mm.
BLM. We spoke with folks who do that on the ground work I described. We also spoke with folks who used to be state directors and even higher in the BLM. And everyone spoke to some degree of kind of fear of the livestock industry's influence and really fear of politicians, senators, and members of Congress getting involved. And we found, numerous instances across the West where, a sitting US senator was willing to wade into something as small as a fence line dispute. And so with that kind of top down power,
Mhm.
there's a bit of a culture within these agencies to say let's not go too far, and because so often when these permits are renewed, they skip the environmental review. It's become easier for them to say, hey, this specific allotment is controversial. Let's just put that in the bucket of the ones we don't have time for. Let's focus on the one over here that may be doing better. And so what we know is there are massive blind spots within how the BLM and
Mhm.
Forest Service kind of regulate and monitor this land.
Can you talk a little bit more in depth about what you said about these lawmakers getting involved to what would seem to be minor disputes? I would think that kind of muddies the waters when it comes to maybe who gets a permit, who doesn't, et cetera.
Yeah, so it certainly has an impact on how permits are overseen. I think what we found, both as we investigate the politics of the system as well as the economics, is that there are, 18,000 or so ranchers using public lands in the West, but much of the benefit, much of the economic control, much of the land sits with the few of them. And I think they certainly have the most kind of power in this sector. You have a system where to get these public lands permits, which grants you access to steeply subsidized public lands, to all sorts of direct subsidy payments through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. To get these permits, you need to have what's called a base property, which is a private ranch that may only be a few hundred or a few thousand acres, but then suddenly that means that the BLM or Forest Service will give you access to hundreds of thousands or millions of acres around that. And so while this is a large industry with a lot of players, we are seeing much of the benefit due to that sort of construction and that sort of historical setup of it kind of go to the biggest and the wealthiest of the ranchers.
Mm. So I want to talk now about the fact that you actually went out to some of these grazing lands with a wildlife ecologist, and you found places where cattle had actually caused quite a bit of damage. But you also went out with ranchers who are really working to find an ecological balance with the land. So can you talk about these trips and the look of the landscape?
Absolutely. We wanted to make sure we saw the best, the worst, and everything in between because obviously not all rancher operates the same way. So we toured grazing allotments in Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, and Montana. And you definitely saw some change just as habitat and precipitation changed. So we saw some rough, I mean, just absolutely destroyed riparian areas around kind of creeks and streams in the desert in Arizona, where I think conservationists made a fair point when they said, why are there cows here at all? I mean, is there any correct way to monitor this? And then we went to areas where it rained more. We went out with a rancher in western Colorado who spent his own money that he didn't really have to spend on virtual fencing to help move his cattle to make sure that he could rotate them more quickly and get them off the land before it got kind of beaten down. Who did soil moisture monitoring and things like that to really ensure that, hey, I'm going to move my herd if the land is telling me I need to, not just if the government is telling me I need to. And so we really saw kind of how different how differently this can be run. But even in the instances where we spoke with ranchers who were very cognizant about environmental stewardship, they were still quick to tell us that, hey, the way to protect the environment is to move cattle more and to let the ground rest when it needs to rest.
So with that said, let's go back to the fact that there's just not enough BLM staff right now to conduct environmental reviews. So how will we know how big the problem might be if there's just not enough staff to literally physically cover the land?
That's why I say there are blind spots, because there are areas where we just don't entirely know. I think if we employ more things like remote sensing via, satellite analysis, there might be ways to do a little bit more efficiently kind of landscape level analyses. It was great that so many folks who are actively working on this within the government were willing to speak with me and willing to kind of put themselves on the line a little bit to pull back the curtain on how this works. Because there are folks who are trying to regulate, who are trying to monitor this, and are just kind of trying to yell out like, we don't have the resources, and there will be blind spots until we do.
So you talked to a range ecologist and with a rancher about grazing. The rancher's name, I believe, was Frank Shorts Jr. And you talked about with him about grazing his sheep on the land. And both of them say that grazing can actually help ecosystems, or at least some ecosystems. Is there any common ground to be found when you talk with ranchers and ecologists?
Yeah, I would say the biggest point that ecologists, conservationists, the government, ranchers all agreed on was that the current permitting system, the current environmental review system, which go hand in hand, is broken as it stands. And what I mean by that is with the inadequate staff that you pointed out, these permits are just automatically renewed. And the conservationists hate that because there's no way to check if the environment is hurting. There's no way to change the permit to say, let's keep cattle off this pasture this time of year because, that's when these birds are mating, or whatever the case may be. On the other side, when you have responsible ranchers, they'll say, well, I have the same issue because the permit is automatically renewed. If I want to try something different, if I want to implement the latest technology, I'm not really allowed to in many cases, because you automatically renew my permit on the exact same terms without any chance to update it. So I would say, both sides are asking for more staffing from federal rangeland managers to give more flexibility and to adapt more quickly to the conditions on a specific grazing allotment.
Before I let you go, Mark, what are you hoping that readers take away from this investigation?
So at a high level, like I said, we got into this because this is the largest land use by far in the West. And we didn't get into this work to say this is wrong, but we wanted to say this is heavily subsidized, this doesn't produce a lot of food, and this oftentimes hurts the ecology. So if we're going to keep the system as it is, let's do that with our eyes wide open. And let's say we understand the consequences, and if the trade-offs are worth it, great. But if there needs to be changes, let's go that path. So really want to force a conversation to just say, we've made this huge decision that has impacted, hundreds of thousands of square miles around the West. Hey, is that really the right decision, the best way to use the land?
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking time to speak with us about this issue. We've been talking with Mark Ololde, who covers the environment, natural resources, and public health around the Southwest for ProPublica. We've been talking about his new series. It's called Free Range, The High Cost of Public Lands Ranching. We'll make sure to put links to his reporting on our website, boisestatepublicradio.org. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, I'm Peter Pruitt from Zoo Idaho.
And I'm Dr. Leif Tapinola with the Idaho Museum of Natural History.
Together we host The Nature of Idaho, a podcast all about how our state's amazing landscapes, wildlife, and geology shape life here in the Gem State.
Each week, we dive into nature stories from across Idaho, everything from fossils to forests, and sometimes even a few fun facts you can share on your next hike.
So join us as we celebrate everything that makes wild Idaho special.
Listen to The Nature of Idaho from KISU, wherever you get your podcasts, or at KISU.org.